Transformation and disruption is just two sides of the same coin. If you go with it and you survive and you do well, then you've transformed. And if you fail because of it, then you've been disrupted. But the first applications are not going to be those transformational disruption ones. They'll be innovative ones. And you can't get someone to change doing something by 3 hours, even when there's an existential threat. So trying to roll out complicated technologies is slow. I think the real impact is going to be on startups and scale-ups, that instead of having to go from 15 people to 100 people, which is very complicated if you've never done it before, they'll be able to go from 15 people to 30 people and have 70 agents running parts of their business. That will allow them to compete very effectively with larger corporations.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we can be better versions of ourselves and build a collective future we actually want to live in. Now, I'm pretty sure that as a psychedelic fractal of infinite consciousness, I chose to incarnate on this planet in this timeline because I wanted to live in quote unquote interesting times. And boy, are these times interesting. Our main mission today is to explore just how interesting they're going to get, because we are going through a period of technological acceleration unlike anything in human history. We are at the convergence of several fundamental technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, and immersive technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality. They are poised to reshape everything from how we work to whole economic structures, and eventually, one might expect, even redefining what it means to be human. If these shifts sound abstract, consider this. In just the past 2 years, AI-generated content has begun replacing human creativity in industries once thought untouchable. And algorithms now influence what we see, what we buy, and even how we think, maybe even how we vote. Meanwhile, augmented reality and virtual reality stand on this edge of making our physical and digital worlds almost indistinguishable. If that sounds like a lot, don't worry. We have a futurologist ready to walk us through just how these technologies could reshape our world. But before we get there, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning PR firm Technica Communications and the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. And before founding those organizations, I was a reporter for NPR and PBS, and I covered things like technology, the environment, and education. And if this is your first or 50th episode, thank you for joining us. Welcome. We love having you here each week, and I hope that you're enjoying the stories that you're hearing. Feel free to share the show with a friend of yours next time you're talking podcasts or sharing some of the information that you've learned on the show. That is the number one thing that you can do to help us grow our community. And if you are feeling like you want to get a little bit more involved, you can follow us on social media, Earthlings Pod, across all the channels. You can email me at lisaann@earthlingspodcast.com and let me know what you think of the show. What did I miss? What did I get wrong? Do you like my hair? I don't care. Send me a note. And you can also join our newsletter, and we'll send you a digest once a month. You won't get a lot of emails from us, I promise. And if you're feeling financially supportive, go on over to Patreon. The link is in the show notes, and become a Patreon member. You will get extended interviews as well as early releases of interviews. So for just $5 a month, so the price of a cup of coffee that you're probably going to buy anyway, you can support all the great people working behind the scenes to make this show possible. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Our guest today would say that we are reaching an inflection point, and how we navigate the next decade will determine whether these technologies create a more equitable, innovative world, something close to the Star Trek version of the future, or one controlled by a handful of elites that perhaps might dictate the rules of engagement for everybody else. Maybe something closer to the futures depicted in the movies like District 9 or Parasite. So our guide on this main mission is Daniel Doll-Steinberg. He's a leading thinker on the future of technology and co author of the book Unsupervised. It's an excellent book, very dense, but also a very quick read. So I highly recommend you have a look at it. You can get a sample and read it for yourself. We'll give you the link in the show notes. Daniel has spent over 3 decades founding technology startups and investing in them. He created one of the first global standards for digital rights management, which helped transform the software and gaming industries. In 2017, he was the first co founder of the Atari Token Project, which was a groundbreaking future of work metaverse project with Atari, an Ethereum founder, and several gaming legends. Daniel was also instrumental in the UK government's 2012 Innovation Report and advised the EU, UK, and French premiers on the recovery from the 2008 financial crash. And he was appointed by the European Commission as an expert advisor on specializing in education, growth, disruption, and future of work policy. He is now the co-founder and partner of EdenBase, and that's an emerging technology ecosystem and fund. So we caught up with Daniel from his office in London, where we kicked off the conversation surrounding these various influences he thinks are coming together to reshape the 21st century into something completely different.
The first is technological, and within those, there are 6 pieces that we identify, first of which is AI, which is not a very good name. Underneath it is quantum computing and smart data, which is what people normally call blockchain, but I would call a smart data protocol. Underneath that is always-on communications, immersive technologies, and self-replicating technologies. So that's the technological side. The second is there are some enormous geopolitical machinations going on across the world. There is a lot of getting used to the end of an era. So, end of eras have interesting features and characteristics, and clearly we're coming to the end of the industrial era. And so, like great empires, they suffer socio-political issues, they suffer self-indulgent issues, etc., etc. And we're seeing a lot of that going on. And then also on top of that is the impact that these technologies are currently having already on the way that we think, the way that we operate, the way that we can be controlled, and the way that we communicate. Those are the main drivers. I think the other 2 things I would add to that is the first is adoption of technology. So, historically, technologies took years to get to 100 million users. Then it was a year, then it was months, then it was days. I think that obscures the reality of it, which is that technologies are being adopted in milliseconds, often manufactured by the technologies themselves when we're using any of our technologies, because it happens in the cloud. I remember in the old days, you would if you had an update, you would get a disk, you'd have to go to your machine, you'd have to update the disk, and if you were in a corporate, you'd have to take that disk, people would take that disk around and put it in your machine. It was obvious that something was happening. And then you had the stage where you would have to download it, and then there was the stage where you would have to accept that it was being updated. Now you have just applications being updated all the time, actually on your machine, but also in the cloud all the time. The second one that I think is very important is dematerialization. So historically, we had lots of items that we would carry or own. Technologies such as the iPhone is dematerializing that into one device. And that device is your library, your newspapers, your total information source, your entertainment machine, your record player, your map, and thousands of other things that you would have physical items for. And that dematerialization was restricted by the fact that processing was not as powerful as it could be. That's being unlocked. As processing goes faster and faster and power consumption becomes better and better, you can make them smaller. But secondly, all the operations of devices now takes place in the cloud. So potentially those devices could become microscopic, just a receiver and a device for us to integrate with us. At the moment, that's the screen and the key, which has a keyboard and a visual. If that were a contact lens, then it could just be a contact lens. And audio, it could potentially be just a cell. So those other trends on top of it, the instant adoption and the dematerialization means that technologies are going to become completely persistent and they will be with us all the time.
And how do you think that might shape different social interactions? Because I can assume, I can guess that there's going to be some folks that don't want to have these types of communications persistent with them, right? And they might separate themselves from society. There are folks that are going to have a lot of wealth, and so they'll adopt these first. It'll give them an edge in life. How do you anticipate society is going to adjust to these things?
Again, that's an incredibly complex and important question. There are a number of pieces at play. First is government and regulation. You know, the EU thought it was very smart rushing into AI regulation, and they love regulation. And what was the result? No Meta AI, no Apple AI, no Open AI, no Google AI on the latest versions are available there. You know, is that positive or negative? I would argue that's incredibly negative if you believe that the future is going to be tech first and your people and your corporates don't have access to it. So that's the first one. The second is individual. You know, are you a type of person that gets addicted quickly to these technologies, or one that can put them down? I mean, in my family, we have five. You know, my wife, myself, and our three kids. We're all different. You know, some of us are very connected to our phones all the times, and others can put them down. And then it becomes down to the value add of the technology. So for me, one of my partners, Ariane, is a people person. He's the best people person I've seen. You know, he networks, he loves people all the time. He remembers everybody. He has that sort of ability. Me, on the other hand, I'm much more. I stick to a lesser number of people. I know a lot more, but I don't deal with them that much, and sometimes I forget their names, the ones that are in the second and third, you know, derivative of the people I'm with a lot. And for me, a contact lens that would remind me who these people are and their names would be incredibly valuable. And you know, the second step of that is when I ran my last project, which was a metaverse project, one of the people that worked for me, actually an amazing Russian woman, just had the ability to remember everybody, their names, what they did, their value in that situation, you know, and a contact lens could be like her. You know, it could allow me to walk into a room, know who everybody is, what I should say to Lisa and Haman to have a conversation that would lead to an output because the contact lens was telling me. It's like these two college students in the US last year modified the software on a Meta glasses that allowed them to recognize people on the street. And they went up to them and said, "Hello, Julia, you know, how's your boyfriend Arthur
Oh my
doing?"
God.
And they didn't know these people, but the people assumed they knew them. That's
Ah,
the human condition. We assume that if someone knows us, we've forgotten. So that puts you at an incredible advantage to everybody else if you have that. So it's quickly becomes, I walk into a room and I can do that, and 10% can and 90% can't. Those 90% are a disadvantage of, in effect, going to school since you were at 16 to going at 22 and learning 22. That doesn't mean that people at 16 aren't successful. It means the percentage of them is much less than those that have educated much longer because their knowledge is greater in certain areas. And so it becomes a massive asymmetric advantage, which means that everybody has to do it. And then you'll have the situation where if I have a contact lens and you have a contact lens, then we can exchange information through that. So the person that doesn't, out of the three of us talking, is suddenly at a massive disadvantage because the amount of information they're getting is a fraction of the information that you and I are sharing. So they're sort of almost forced down that path. So if you add all those together, it's almost impossible to say where the future is going to be. It's just likely to bring enormous efficiencies and productivity gains and, in effect, superhuman powers to people. And therefore, people will go out of their way to do it, especially for their children.
And all of this is sort of centered around this idea that you mentioned before, the Industrial Revolution sort of coming to an end, and we're sort of in this transition phase. We've heard a lot of talk around the information age and also the attention economy. How do you anticipate our economic structures are going to adjust to all of these foundational technologies coming online?
You've got to look at all the pieces. So attention economy is because these devices are capturing our attention and they're getting better and better at it. Then you've got to look at the way that we're acting with people is changing, the way that our society is changing, the way that certain people are pushing certain agendas, the way that certain people, like the Luddites, want to stick to the rules that we have today when people are building new rules, which means because there are so many pieces at play in each of these areas, the outcome is very, very difficult to determine. What I'm very determined for myself, and what I try and encourage everyone else to do, is not just assume that the information that you have is correct, but also that being in your domain anymore is enough. My background is my father was Jewish. But my parents are both dead, sadly. But my father was Jewish. His family was completely wiped out in the Second World War by the Germans. My mother is an Aryan German who converted to Judaism at the age of, late 20s. So my only living family were German. And being a little Jewish kid, spending the summers in Germany is odd. Being a Jewish kid in London with your family being German is also odd. And so from a very young age, when I was growing up in the 70s, the Second World War was still very, very raw in Europe. And so it was there. And to have both sides of that, one was the German side and one was the Jewish side, to the same set of data and the different thought processes is really interesting to have. And then to add to that, my father made all his money in Iran in the 70s, and Iran and Israel and Jews were very close, or the regimes. And then suddenly by the 80s, when he still had they didn't work anymore in Iran, obviously, but he still had his business partner and his Iranian friend. So I had that whole dynamic going on. And it taught me as a very young age that you can look at one fact and then look at that same fact in multiple ways. But then also you can throw in another fact that changes the context of that fact. And those contextual facts change the perception of the existing fact. So one of my partners here is constantly telling me about fake news and, deep fakes. And I'm saying, what's that? What is fake news? If it's science, if it's maths, that's our best understanding of a fact. Science, I was having a debate with a friend of mine in San Francisco about Newtonian and quantum physics. And he was telling me that quantum physics, or he's telling someone else, and I was debating with him, quantum physics explains everything. And I said, well, actually, 100 years ago, we thought Newtonian physics explained everything. Now we think we know with quantum physics, but that doesn't mean it's right. We might find in 20 years' time that there's something else that explains it better. And we had a bit of a debate about it because he's very scientific. He's an incredible guy. But so there isn't a fact. There is only data, and that data can be correct and incorrect, but it can also be correct and incorrect on your time, on your reference, on your location, on your mood, and then how it's presented. So we are entering this very interesting age where everything is based on data and everything is going to be based on data, but our understanding of the data and our use of the data and our worries about the data are misinformed. And therefore, I think the outcome is likely not to be positive for many people, and we're going to go through this phase. I was another friend I was with in San Francisco also runs a very large family office, and we were talking about DEI, and what he doesn't use gender language, and he doesn't do this and he doesn't do that. He's a very what's the word, well-rounded person. He's not very woke particularly, but he's well-rounded. And I was saying the problem we've got at the moment is we're brand new to all these things, so we haven't decided as a human race, or culturally and societally and community human races, what the rules are for each of these. And I gave him an analogy. I said, what is equal? In sports we think everything's equal. He liked this because he's not a big fan of Trump. And I said, but if I play you in tennis and you're better than tennis, you will beat me every single time. But if you're better than me at golf, we have a handicap and I might beat you half the time. So we've decided in golf that equal is a handicap, and we've decided in tennis that equal is you're better, and so we have to decide that with data, with everything that we're working on. And it becomes complex, as I said, because it depends on the time and the context and the location and the situation of the people that are discussing that data point. So as I say, it's such a difficult question.
What you're saying reminds me of how certain folks will talk about how you see the world through your own perception, and you have certain stories about your life or who you are, or what you expect to see. And so then your mind, being a pattern recognition machine, sees those things and reminds you, oh, hey, remember that story about you not being good enough? See, there's another data point right there, right? And and how we have all this data, yet it's like you say, it's almost like open to interpretation, and context plays a really strong influence on how you might interpret some data. But then you have human beings who, generally speaking, feel unsafe. So they want things to be black and white so that they can feel more secure around knowing something is true or not. But so we hear people say we're in this post-truth world, and I think folks say it in sort of a derogatory term, relating to like fake news, if you will. But maybe it's broader than that, in the sense that there's so much data and so many different ways to look at it through different lenses, that you can see something that you want to see.
And again, firstly, that's correct. But secondly, it's also time related and location related. So, for instance, I went out with my co-author for a drink on Sunday for lunch in a very nice wine bar in Mayfair. And he was saying to me, if you look at your organization, one of your partners has created the most successful scale up in solutions and programs in the world. If I was ever going to do that, you would go to him. He said, you seem to be, ever since I met you first in 95, most of what you say comes true. So you seem to know what's going on. You have this incredible team. You're going to be incredibly successful and you're going to raise billions and etc. And you feel very good for a while. And then you go to the office on Monday morning and then something hasn't happened that you were expecting it to happen. And you go, oh, okay, now my context has changed. And yes, he's right. But also, you know, there is a location and a context point and a data point that changes that. And humans are very good at dealing with it's our survival, but it's also a downfall. Is we take one data point and we can extrapolate from that, and then the next minute, let's say Tuesday morning, you were doing an SPV as we did, and it was all sold out within 24 hours, and we were expecting it to be a week, and you'd suddenly think, yeah, we're fantastic again. 99.99% of the data is the same, but you've come up with a completely different conclusion. And the way that you deal with that conclusion is also important. You're then feeling very positive, and therefore positive things happen to you, or you're feeling negative. And so the point about this that's so important is, as we outsource that to compute, how do we get compute to not emphasize the negatives, but actually provide benefits that allow us to be better, and to deal with those fluctuations rather than accentuating those fluctuations. And I think that's something we're going to have to really work hard on over the next few years, because once those foundations are set and the people that control those foundations are set, it's going to be very difficult to unwind them.
I want to get into some more of the technology that you written about in your book that's coming online based on these foundational technologies that you mentioned, AI, blockchain. And so one of them is, well, you mentioned metaverse. And so we have virtual reality, augmented reality, Internet of Things. And how do you think we're going to start implementing these in both the business and personal world? And where do you think the first applications might show up?
So the first things is, as I said, I look at six technologies. I look at the AI. And again, AI is a terrible word. It's not artificial. It's not intelligent, and it will never be. Um, I don't think either. I don't think it will be intelligent. It will be something else. It might be better than us, but it won't. I don't think unless we build a brain, and I don't see why we would want to. It's not going to be intelligent. There is quantum computing. There is the smart data layer, the protocols, and then there's the ones you were mentioning, the immersive layer, which is AR, VR, which is the communication between us and compute. There is always on communications, and there is self-replicating technologies. And so when you add those together, I think that's where the massive transformational disruptions will come. And transformation and disruption is just two sides of the same coin. If you go with it and you survive and you do well, then you've transformed. And if you fail because of it, then you've been disrupted. But the first applications are not going to be those transformational disruption ones. They'll be innovative ones. There'll be things like, for instance, agents. Those are going to be coming online, within the next 18 months, I would have thought. Difficult to find people that are building them, that you can actually use, but assume 18 months. And they will allow two types of things. I think the first, they would allow large corporations to do things much more efficiently. But one of my roles was stopping one of the biggest banks in the world being shut down by the regulators. And you can't get someone to change doing something by 3 hours, even when there's an existential threat. So trying to roll out complicated technologies is slow. I think the real impact is going to be on the startups and scale ups, that instead of having to go from 15 people to 100 people, which is very complicated if you've never done it before, they'll be able to go from 15 people to 30 people and have 70 agents running parts of their business. I see that. And that will allow them to compete very effectively with larger corporations. Some of the other things that, we're going to clearly see is we're going to see some sort of, over the next few years, these AR devices. I think what Meta is doing particularly is very interesting, that allow us to interact with the world in different ways. And I'm really excited by some of that stuff that's being built. The other things are, if you're looking at the quantum space, if we'd said in 2020, and I use 2020 specifically, that for AI to be useful, it has to be AGI, which again, two things that don't make sense. AGI makes even less sense than AI, artificial general intelligence, because what on earth is that when you come to computing? But if you said in 2020, for AI to be useful, you need AGI, then you would be talking, in those days, 15 to 20 years away. And one of the debates I had with one of my partners here, Eric, is I kept banging the table going, AI, this stuff, GPT, is going to start impacting us within 3-4 years. And he was saying, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. Because I wasn't looking at AGI. I was saying, when is it going to practically do something useful that is so good that it's going to be necessary to use? And, my prediction was 2025. Sam Altman was even faster. And I identified Sam Altman as the guy that was going to do it in 2020. And we're making that mistake with quantum. We're doing the same thing in 2025, which is, for quantum to be quantum, it has to be a fully functioning RSA cracking machine that can be operated by many people. And again, that's not answering the right question. It's saying, when is it going to do something that's highly useful? And I think that's 18 months to 2.5 years away. And what do I mean by that? It's going to be able to do things like matching, drug discovery, chemical discovery, the nitrogen issue, making nitrogen is one of the most intensive energy consumers on the planet. If we can solve that, that's phenomenal for saving the planet, or saving the resources of the planet. But then if you can do Monte Carlo simulation, which is what's behind derivatives, which is the biggest asset class in the world, what's behind insurance, which is possibly the most important service that we offer. If you're talking about 18 to 24 months that we can completely rewrite the insurance business or start to completely rewrite it. We can insure people that should not be insured under the current models, or we can reduce insurance premiums, or we can allow people to do things that they couldn't do before because of insurance. Can you imagine if we could say starting a startup could be insured? So your investors got their money back. I mean, sounds farcical, but you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Those type of things, I think we're 18 to 24 months away from being able to start looking at. And when you look at the financial industry, it's worth so many hundreds of trillions of dollars that a few percent on that starts to make real difference. And when you add that to what I was talking about, the agentic AI and the immersive layer, you might get a company made up of 4 people based in, I don't know, Nigeria. It doesn't need to be the US anymore, that might rewrite the whole system that is better than our AXAs and our big insurance companies. And people migrate to that really quickly because they've offered a better premium, or they've offered a better an insurance policy you couldn't possibly get. Those are going to be the really radical changes that we're going to see quickly. I mean, in the midterm, not the immediate ones.
Some of us have heard about AI agents, and then we've also heard terms like AI employees. Is that just a level up from an agent, do you anticipate?
I just think that's a clever marketing gimmick. The definition of agent that I like is it is an AI that transacts, and so that it can do things on your behalf, either with your permission or without your permission. Explicit, usually implicit permission rather than explicit, because it can't transact if it's always waiting for explicit permission. Because you can do that with the current AI, you can say book it for me, but it actually transacts, and so once you've got an agent that can action what it's doing, then in effect, if you program that to be a lawyer that can actually act upon and write the contract and send it out, then that's in effect an employee. Now, whether that's a rounded lawyer or whether that's just an agent that writes the best contracts for you when you ask it for and packages it all up and puts it ready, or books your travel for, whether it's a fully functional travel department in the corporate that can work out all the machinations of moving around on day one, or whether it's just something that you can go to and say, I need to go to Geneva next week. Can you book everything for me? And then it comes back and it's done everything and it's worked out that you're actually going on a bank holiday. So, maybe you need to go a day later and not have them, because you're not going to be able to get anything done on the day that you thought you might. That is a level of function that a corporate or a small company needs that could be done by an employee. So I think the fully rounded lawyer or the fully rounded accountant or the fully rounded salesperson, I think that's further away. But as we know, in tech, and they love to market things that don't quite exist and fix it later. So, but I think that's and being realistic, I think they will get there. So it's just they won't get there in the period that they think they will.
And do you think virtual influencers fall under that category of an AI agent that transacts? Or do you think it's in a different category?
We already had many years ago in 2018, 2019, virtual models. Michaela was one. I don't see that I see that's possible today. The question is whether there's a market demand for it. I don't know whether there's a market demand for it. These AI or virtual influencers, there are a few of them, and they make a reasonable amount of money. But they're nothing on the scale of the supermodels or the big influencers. And I don't know whether that's because we're not ready for it, or people don't want it, or they're not good enough, or they haven't been marketed, or there's, there might be a lot of reasons behind that. I don't think my knowledge is great enough to be able to decide whether a virtual influencer could be the same as an influencer. I know the value obviously for a studio, if they're making movies with virtual characters, is they're investing in their own IP from day one. Whereas if they're investing in an actor, they're investing in someone else's IP, and he becomes super successful, and they need him for a follow-up movie or another movie, and he's 20 times more expensive or 100 times more expensive, and then he wants to fly
Yeah.
first class to every location, and then you need people to follow them, and so to have that all done in the lab when you own everything about them and you can change their eye color because you in that movie that it's for a market that prefers blue eyes to brown eyes. You can't do that with Tom Cruise, I guess, but you could do it with or it would be difficult to do it with him. It would, unless he really believed in the part. But if it's your own IP, you can do whatever you like whenever you like. So the value is there. It's just whether people accept that as something they want to consume.
Some folks certainly see the value of, I would say, copying celebrities' voices or likenesses for their own so that they don't have to pay that person. So Scarlett Johansson is a perfect example of that. OpenAI wanted to hire her to do the voice, and she declined. And then lo and behold, the voice that they have is remarkably similar to her voice. And I find it very interesting that she's kind of become an activist now to protecting artists, creative rights and IP. So this leads to another question that I have for you, which you mentioned in the book, how all this technology and all this data and all these different new activities that can be done could also lead to more fraud, more spamming, more phishing, and those things being severely more sophisticated and folks being duped faster and in higher quantities. Explain to us about what you write about in the book and what you see here.
Well, clearly it's an arms race. So if you're a Nigerian spammer, the famous ones, probably can't say Nigerian spammer anymore, but it's a sort of generic spammer from that area. They're time limited. And what one of my kids told me many years ago, he said, they always make typos in the emails they send to you and grammar mistakes. And they do that because they only want people that don't notice things, because the people that notice everything will waste their time because they'll determine they're a spammer. So they've wasted a lot of time. Now, with an AI, you don't have a time issue because that you don't have to pay them, and you can have, multiple on a single device operating. So I think that obviously increases the opportunity for going after more people. They can also become much more sophisticated because they can learn very quickly, unlike a human, about the person they're trying to deal with. But we had the same issue when the internet came along. Before the internet came along, it was quite difficult to defraud somebody. You'd have to go. I mean, it was easy, but you would have to go into a bank. You'd have to be that type of person. You'd have to pretend you were the person, or you'd have to take them in, or whatever, or phone the bank. And then suddenly everyone was online, and we saw this massive spike in online fraud. And then you got the antivirus agents, and then you've got the banks becoming more sophisticated. And I think we'll just go through the same thing, which is, there will be a spike at the beginning as people learn what's going on, and then they will catch up, and then there will be going forward. So but yes, in the short term, and I don't know how long that short term is, you're going to have big issues. If they can replicate my voice by listening to it for 3 seconds, and they can phone up the bank, or someone can turn up at the door of my, phone my wife on video phone and say, I'm outside, open the door. Those are very short term, significant problems. And I don't think we're dealing with those yet. I mean, humans tend to deal with things after they're an issue, which is why it's always very difficult to sell cybersecurity solutions, because no one wants to buy quantum safe technology, even though quantum could destroy their business overnight, because they haven't been hacked by a quantum. But once they're hacked by a quantum, it's too late, and everybody, so we do suffer from this a little bit. But the whole concept of, I think it goes back to a deeper question, which is another debate I have with my partner, with one of my partners, is, he's always says, well, you always need humans in the loop. And I say, why? If the AI is better at doing something, or the technology is better than doing something, why do we need a human in the loop? And I think he's sort of moving to my side of the fence. But humans, and and I think that ties in very nicely with what you were saying about Scarlett Johansson, which is humans are a pain. You know, they have rights. They decide they want to operate in certain ways. They decide they want to do things. We don't know what the motivation was for OpenAI to copy her voice. Might have been a marketing thing. We don't know what her motivation was for objecting at that time, you know. And so those are problematic. It's clearly better for a studio, to use that example, to never hire an actor again and just start IP native, because in 20 years' time, there won't be any actors that they have to worry about because they'll all be, too old to be worried about, and they'll have a new class of IP. So it's, if they can get away with it, they will. If Warner can decide that every movie they make doesn't need a lead actor, it just needs AI and virtual images, and it will sell as, it will make them as the same amount of money and create as good a brand, then that's fine. I mean, it's like a cartoon. That's what a cartoon was, wasn't it? When you had the original cartoon magazines, all the IP was created by the people. They didn't. Batman couldn't say to Marvel. I don't think it's a Marvel. I think it's DC. But I don't know who Marvel one is now. Captain America, maybe. I think he's Marvel. Captain America couldn't say in the cartoon, "Well, I don't want to do that. I'm not ready for that today. I don't want to wear that outfit." It was up to the person that was drawing it, and so it's a very effective model, and it's an effective model. The reason I mention that, it's an effective model for everybody. If a company operates with 5 people or 10 people who own all the equity, and they have 1,000 agents or 1,000 non-humans doing the work, that do it without what they can use, they can get rid of, they can decide you're not working today, or we prefer that one, without having the difficulties of dealing with the individual. That's a much more effective way of running your business. And so that is why this is so problematic. And then you get into the whole thing, and I do talk about this a little bit. At what point do those agents have rights? And you sort of mentioned that too. At what point do they have rights that you can't get rid of them? You can't make them redundant. And we say that's farcical, but the way the world has been going, I don't think it's as farcical as all that. You're not allowed to turn AI off because they have some sentiency. And so those problems, like the DEI that we were talking about earlier, will have to be figured out by humans, and we will go too far the wrong way and we'll go back. But what you've led to with your 3 last questions is very much this, which is a human free world is actually more effective for the people that are running those organizations that are delivering those services. And the tragedy for humanity of the Industrial Revolution is, before the Industrial Revolution, people had no value to the people that controlled everything. They would just, they put them in the army, they did this, they did that, they chose, whether they lived or died or starved to death was of no relevance generally. And then we have the 1780s and we have the Industrial Revolution, and everybody had, certainly in the West, everybody had a right to vote and a right to healthcare. And it's gone to what I'm calling the position we're in now, which is how we started, which is, we live in this society, which I think is the end of that, where you're seeing very extreme cases of that come along, which actually accelerates the move to employee-free organizations. And they won't be the Citibanks and the JP Morgans of the world. They will be neobanks that are starting today. We've invested in 4 now. 4, they're not all neobanks, but fintechs that are small teams between 10 and 40 people that we believe could scale with a fraction of the staff that is required, and provide a better service, because they're already providing an innovative service that is providing something that's not available in the market, but that takes over the entire finance industry. And then we've got to look at what's finance become. If agents are running all of our finance, they're not going to run it with money, because money is a very human thing. They will run it with something else. And then we propagate down and we say, well, banks have no value at all because there's no money. And then our entire financial infrastructure has no value because we have no money. And what then happens? Those are the things that I'm trying to think about all the time. And I have no answer, and I probably won't have any answer until a year before they happen or 2 years before they happen, and hopefully I'm right. But we need to be looking for that.
So let's back it up a little bit. When you talk about there would be no money because that's a very human thing, physical thing. Can you explain that a little bit deeper? Like, what would replace it? Do you think digital currency or something completely different?
Well, I think it's more likely to be a digital something. I don't know if it's going to be a digital currency because a currency is money. It will be a digital something. I don't think I mean, there might be some people that can guess what it might be. I don't think I'm in a position yet to see it. But if you look at what is the root of money? It's a transfer of value, isn't it? And a statement of account. And that's what it was for. And it was built from the people lending people money early on and then needing to transact. So I had a sheep and you had 5 chickens, and, 5 chickens wasn't worth a sheep. So you sold your 5 chickens for money, and then you could buy with your friend a sheep because you pooled your money, and that allowed transactions to happen. And then we needed, because of that basis, we then created mechanisms that handled money, which were banks. And it was all, you watch the Westerns, don't you? And they rob banks because all the money's stuck in the safe. And then they decided having money stuck in the safe was not the best way because they could be robbed. So they went to a more, centralized system where they kept very little money in the safe, but the bank accounts were just virtual bank accounts. So they said, we're not going to have enough. We don't have all the money for all the people in here. We just have enough for a week, and then a day, and then we would replenish it or not, when necessary. And so that whole industry was generated by that original need. And then and the Industrial Revolution was going on at the same time, which means workers had to be paid, and it was eventually they were paid in cash. And then we decided paying them in cash was not a good idea because the tax authorities couldn't ensure that they were getting all the money they needed. So they said, you can't pay people in cash anymore. You have to pay them in, you know,
Checks
into their
and then
bank. Yeah.
electronic. Yep.
And then electronic, but it's all a derivative of that. But that's all of that is human based. It's all to do with what humans needed. If 90% of my organization or more, let's say I run a bank. Let's say I run a bank in 2035 and it's 8 people and 15,000 agents. Well, what are the agents going to get paid in? And you'll say, well, they don't need to pay because they're AI. But then you'll say, but they need to be rewarded because they'll be let's use the word intelligent. I don't like it, but they'll be intelligent. So you have to reward them for good decisions. So that's why we pay people. We reward them for doing good things, in effect. If you have an employee that's doing terrible things, you get rid of them, you don't pay them. And you pay more money to the people that are producing more. And the CEO, you know, is more effective to you than, someone that's just starting as an intern, and therefore they get paid more. And if their decisions are good, they get good bonuses. And if their decisions are bad, they get fired. So it's a it's a it's a reward system, and so there's nothing to assume that those technologies won't want a little reward system or won't operate. I mean, that's blockchain is based on reward systems, isn't it? That's the whole basis of it, and computers and tokens. So I don't know. I don't know what that means, but if 99% of the transactions in my organization are to technologies, what does that look like? They don't need to go to the shop to buy food. They might need to go to the shop to buy energy. I don't know. That might be, that might be that is their source of energy, buying energy off the grid. Or they might be virtual. They might actually have virtual embodiments, which means they go out for a virtual drink and therefore they want to buy virtual clothes. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but I don't actually know what that looks like, but it's unlikely that if our economy is 10,000 times the economy today, because 99,999 of it is technology rather than human, what is the majority transaction and asset class and exchange of value item for that economy. But I think that's the economy that we're going to be living in. So we have to be conscious so the people that run, let's say it might be the future that JP Morgan still is worth, I don't know, $100 billion, but this new bank is worth $100 trillion or $500 trillion because it's doing a million times the volume of transactions at JP Morgan. That means two things. One, it means the majority transaction is in something new, but it also means JP Morgan has no power because it's 1 millionth of the size of what's coming after it. And that's my whole thing about the end of the Industrial Revolution, moving to like the end of the agricultural age. They still have the land and you still have the horses and you still have the fields and the wheat and all those things, but the value and the power of them, of those people and that asset class is, apart from the fact that everyone needs to eat and therefore food is an important supply and we all need to live somewhere, its actual value to the world. They don't own the newspapers. They don't own they didn't own the factories. They didn't own the retailers. They owned something that was irrelevant. And that your question led to the answer, which is we don't know, but we have to be concerned that that's where the power will lie.
I'm glad you brought that all together because I think about we've interviewed a lot of folks in the agricultural industry, and what I've learned is that today agriculture, being a farmer, it's more of a way of life than a career, right? And now, if we're coming to the end of the industrial age, will manufacturing physical things eventually become a way of life, and you're a craftsman rather than owning a business that makes a lot of money. And we see that with horses and equestrian sports, right? They're still around, but we don't use them for transportation anymore. So you move into this new type of economy that is based on all these foundational technologies that you mentioned. I've heard some people ideate that there might be very powerful, wealthy tech billionaires out there who can see a new economy that is basically techno fiefdoms and techno feudalism, if you will, where all of the money and all the assets and the generating capacity of the economy is done from compute, as you've been talking about. And then where do humans fit into that? Are we going to be left behind, or are we going to be somehow like taken care of in a way, like we become like pets? All of our needs are taken care of and we don't have anything to do. And then you think about all of our government processes are related to taxing humans. So if AI and AI agents are not really being compensated per se, and if we're using something different from money, then how do governments operate if humans aren't doing as much of the work? Like our entire system is based on humans doing work, being taxed for that, and then spending the rest of their money within the economy.
That is the most important question thus far. What happened to that? Firstly, let me just say, and this is what I wrote in 2020, and I still believe it, that there are a bunch of people. I don't know how many there are, but there's certainly a bunch of people, and I would class myself in them, that believe that we're going to be a tech first world and the power is shifting. The people that you talked about, I'm not one of. I'm not one of the tech owners of a very large company that's doing this. There's sadly only a handful at the moment. And I suspect they realize what's going on. I mean, if you look at them, who they are, they're very, very smart people. And whilst they live in an echo chamber and they've got enormous organizations to run, which is a disadvantage, both of those, I think they understand what's going on. And one of the things, I think one of the big indicators of that is, everyone complained that WEF, the World Economic Forum at Davos, is the elite power structure that is running the world. Now, I think that's a sort of negative way of saying the truth, which is the people that go to WEF are the people that run the industrial age, and the leaders of the government that either want jobs eventually in the industrial age or are part of that club. And I'm not saying that in any, positive or negative light. I'm just saying that as a fact. And the tech guys don't go. I don't see the Zuckerbergs or the Musks or the Gates goes, but I think he's part of I classify him as, he's had the end of his career in the industrial age, even though he's created one of the titans of the new age. And his world outlook, again, I don't want to say negatively or positively, I have my views, but his world outlook is not tech anymore. It's to do with environment and health and pharma and all those things, misguided or not. But that's his outlook. But the tech guys don't go. And the new tech guys, some of them go, but they only go because some of their friends go, but they're not really part of the WEF. They're part of the outside community. And I think as they get bigger and bigger, they stop going. I know, of course, that most of those companies do have representation there, but they don't have the people with the real power there. And so I think that's a significant indicator of where they believe the power's going. And so that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, which is also fundamental, is what then happens? And my book is a warning piece. I'm a very optimistic person, but it's a warning piece because I wanted to I mean, when I counted the pages, they're about equal in positive and negative, but the pieces get involved or you're irrelevant. So I guess that's a warning. And what it says is, because we're moving into this new age with this new power structure, and there will be a new greater economy, does that relegate the human to secondary to the tech and to the people that control the tech? And one of the things I really believe, again, not in a conspiratorial or a sort of Terminator way, but these technologies are becoming so good at doing what we can do that eventually they'll just do what we can do and build themselves. And not for evil intent necessarily, they'll just be better than us at building them. And therefore, the owners of the companies will have no idea what they're building. In fact, I suspect if you went to Zuckerberg and Musk and asked them how the technologies within their technologies are predicting things on a user level, they probably don't know anymore because the technologies are self-determining which ones to keep on and which ones to turn off. And so it gets to the final point of your question, which is, I guess, the most important question we have is humans don't do very well, unlike pets, if they're just kept to do nothing. In fact, the societies that are most awful in the world are those where the people have limited value or are the recipients of aid and only aid. And we see the most horrific examples of that across the Middle East now, particularly what was happening today, of people who have nothing to live for and are just recipients of aid, of people that want to keep them in a position for their own use. And it's not a pretty outcome for humans. So being a recipient of aid, however beneficial your benefactor is, to use a word twice for that, I don't think would suit us. And I think we would decay into the messes we've seen around the world. One of the reasons that the US is such a strong economy is people, even though it's the wealthiest economy in the world, it is the economy that everybody wants to do something more. And there's a real can-do attitude, and I want to achieve something more. It's not an attitude that you also get around the world in some other commodity-rich states where we have a lot of money, but we don't really want to do anything. We don't care about educating. And even if we do, it's just so that we got a Harvard degree, but we didn't really learn anything. We just went there for it. And they don't have a can-do attitude. And therefore, their entire society is based on, the recipients of a beneficial benefactor, which in this case is the commodity, or is is of a certain set of people saying, "Here, have as money that you want." And again, that is the greatness of the US. The greatness of the US is it's managed to continue through all its ills and through, a very polarized nation from time to time, to have an attitude that I have an opportunity to create something great. It's a relative opportunity. And some people have a better opportunity because they're smarter, they're better looking, they were born into a nicer city or with nicer parents. Again, some of those are disadvantages too. My father, who was a refugee to the UK and made money, always said to me, "Your disadvantage, Daniel, is you were born with money." He considered that a disadvantage, because it lessens my desire. I mean, I still have a lot, but who knows? But so if we end up in this state where we become the beneficiaries of other people who decide or not whether we're of any value to them, firstly, our societies will decay. And we see that. We see evidence of that everywhere. And also if you tell people they've got no hope, then they end up in a town with no hope, and it decays. If you tell them they've got enormous hope and there's something to live for, one of the things that I learned, I mean, this is a slight segue, but one of the things I sort of learned is the wrong word, but sort of thought a concept I got, which is if your life is generally getting better, it doesn't matter where it starts from, you feel positive. And if your life is getting slowly worse, it doesn't really matter where you start from, you feel bad. So if you're a billionaire that's slowly losing all their money, even if it might be over 1,000 years, you generally feel bad. If you're worth zero and you're making more every day. And the indications of that, I mean, I haven't done any scientific research on it, but my indications of that are as follows. When I lived in New York, when I was a 26-year-old kid, I earned a lot of money. I had a 360-degree view in my apartment. It was the most amazing apartment. But after 3 months, I had to force myself to appreciate what I had. And my godfather was in Auschwitz. He's still alive, actually. And I asked him, "What's it like?" He goes, "You get used to it." And that's the most horrific thing to say, but it's actually, we do get used to it. But his life, he lived, his whole family were killed in front of him, but he lived. And his life, he's still alive, it generally got better. He got a good job. He became an executive. He didn't want to get married. Obviously, being through that, you don't want to have kids. But, he had his chill kids like me, and he had a good life, and his life was generally getting better. So he was a very happy person, despite that horrific start. And I know people who are very, most people consider very successful and generally are happy because they don't feel they're achieving anything. So that outcome you describe, I think, is probably the worst outcome, and for every single reason. And so we really have to find a way to have value. And your idea, which is quite an interesting one, I really like the thought, which is, people that work on the land do it because it becomes their way of life. Sometimes it's very hard. My son's girlfriend is a daughter of a farmer, and they have a very, it's a tough life. In fact, she went on holiday with him when she was 21. It was the first holiday she'd ever had. They're not like they have nothing, but it's difficult to run a farm now. And moving into a creative field that you'd suggest, I think it's a really interesting thing that becomes your way of life, might be a really interesting solution. I'd never thought of that.
Well, I've watched a lot of Star Trek, and that's kind of how that whole economy works, right?
I watched a lot of Star Trek and I didn't get that. So there you go.
Earthlings. I will take a Star Trek future over nearly any other sci-fi future that's been imagined. Although I don't necessarily want to live through any of the wars that were in Star Trek. So can I pick like a prosperous peacetime future in Star Trek? Or the metaverse in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash did seem pretty fun. So I might take that too. We didn't even touch on the metaverse in our conversation with Daniel. So definitely a reason to have him back. And we're going to cover a lot more. So this was only part 1. Part 2 is coming up, and we're going to explore the geopolitical shifts that these technologies are accelerating, the potential collapse of money as we know it. Because if AI is doing all the work, like, do you need money? How is that going to work? How are you going to reward the AIs? They don't need money. And whether or not we might be heading into a world of something like techno-feudalism, where a small group of people control everything for the rest of us. Until then, Earthlings, may you find yourself cautiously optimistic about the future on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.